So this is part 3 of our series on interior lighting, in particular for like ArchViz. In part 1, we covered actually setting up our scene, getting all of our prerequisites, getting all of our light masks and light map UVs set in place. In part 2, we covered how you set up our exterior lighting, so that's our directional light and our skylight. For part 3, we're actually jumping what I think is kind of the fun, the much more glamorous side of this, and that is getting our interior lighting built. So to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is jump in and show a few examples of what it is that we're working with and or different types of lighting that you will encounter and how to use them effectively. So let's go and get started with that. So I'm going to fly around here real quick and show you the different lighting examples that more than likely you will run into that we have set up in the scene. So the first thing that I want to do is kind of fly over here. I'll deactivate my game mode. And this is this under cabinet lighting. Now don't worry, we'll dive into each one of these separately. But this is one example where we have an under mount light with an IES profile, so that's kind of the shape of the light, bouncing in and affecting kind of this kitchen area. The next one that I want to jump to is where we actually use an emissive material to project light into the scene. So kind of these faux LED lights underneath the cabinets, that's all done purely through an emissive material. So that's our second type. The third type is going to be this point light. So I've got here, kind of inside of this lamp, that is essentially casting this omnidirectional light from a particular source. So that's our third type. The fourth type is where I've got kind of this lamp here. So I've got a spotlight nested inside of this this object. I'll show you how to set up a blueprint in a little bit. And it's casting kind of this this spot projection into the scene. And again, this one's using an IES profile as well. That's why we get kind of these bands and these rings. So that's our fourth type. And then our fifth type is something that's essentially very similar to the lamp that I just showed, but in this case it's a track light with a much more narrow focused light, but we've got 5 of them. And again, we've set this up as a blueprint to make things a little bit easier for us. So those are the 5 different types of lights that we're going to cover in this. So the first one I'm going to cover is we're actually going to jump back to the under cabinet lighting, since I think that's one of the more simple ones. We'll start there and then we'll work our way through all these. Okay, so for this first lighting example, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this to explain and unpack the basics of lighting that you'll see propagate throughout all of the rest of the lighting types that we use. So if there's one section to focus on when it comes to learning lighting, it's this one right here. So let's go ahead and get started. Now what I've done is I've just simply added a spotlight into our scene. So I can come back over here, and I can go to spotlight, drag it in, and set it up to where we need. So I'm going to kind of position it underneath. There's our light. And there we go. So we have our first example of our light. Now, rather than me go through each of the steps with this, I'm going to kind of explain using, so I'll go ahead and delete this, the light that we already have in here, which should make things, I think, a little bit easier. So kind of working our way from the top down, what I want to focus on here is the different lighting types. Now, because this particular scene is going to be mostly bake lighting, I'm not super concerned about making it movable or stationary. In fact, I want it static because I want it to have the best lighting results possible, and I don't really need this to be a dynamic light. With that being said, by setting it to static, if I kind of zoom down here, you can see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lights on the underside of our cabinet. If I were to set all of these to dynamic, so that's using stationary and movable, at some point I'm going to have more than 4 overlapping lights, and what occurs through that, let me go ahead and set this to movable, and I'll show you. I'll just duplicate this. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So now I have 4 overlapping. As soon as I add my 5th, you should notice, maybe, okay, well, it's not updating for me. But at some point, actually, you know what? They're too far apart. But at some point, with these dynamic lights overlapping, what's going to occur is I'm going to get a red checkbox or a kind of a red light letting me know that I have too many overlapping stationary lights. So I'll go ahead and delete this. For principle's sake, and I'm probably rambling on too much about this, I just want it set to static because I want it to have the best light possible. Okay, Enough about that subject. All right, so this is a principle I covered in video 2, part 2 of this series. And with that, it has to do with the way we get the light to interact with the scene. Again, this is going to be, I think, the number one problem most lighting artists are going to face is, I've got two different thoughts, or at least two different things I am focused on when it comes to lighting. One is my first point of contact, and the second is the energy that it projects into the scene. What do I mean by that? So this particular light, so I'll go ahead and just click off of this, go back to our game mode. So this light is actually casting light down. Now our first point of contact is where it hits an object with that light. So on the wall, down here. That is going to be directly influenced by our intensity. The second thing is the energy that it's projecting into the room. So if I back up a little bit, ignore the splotches, that's just because this was built with preview lighting. But as that light hits those objects, there's energy from it that kind of gets cast back into the scene. So those are the two things I'm focused on. And to affect those, it's going to be our intensity and our indirect lighting intensity. So with this, the way I would approach this is go ahead and set my light to undermount, maybe set it to movable so I can get an indication of where it is. I would increase my intensity, so you can see that's probably way too big. Of course it's going, but if I increase this to like 3, you can see here the contact point is probably a little too bright, so I know my intensity is too high. So I'll take this back down, 2.9. And then I would go ahead and just build my lighting and see how it is. Now, without going or spending too much time. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take this guy back down to 1, which is its default. And I'm going to go ahead and just build my lighting real fast. So I'm going to take it under preview, build lighting only. This is the only light we have in our scene, so it should be really quickly. And I'll show you the results that we get. Actually, you know what? Cancel that real quick. I forgot we set it to movable. Switch it back to static so it's actually affecting our build, or actually built lighting. We'll go ahead and do this again. We'll see the results that we get, and then we'll jump back and I'll explain what we need to change. Okay, so now that our lighting's finished, it's pretty apparent what our problem is. So with the first point of contact, again, where this light is hitting the wall and stuff, it looks great. It's fine. It's got the intensity I'm looking for. It's not too bright. It's not too dark. But if I zoom out a little bit, you can see that it really doesn't do much for the rest of the scene, right? Like if I kind of look at the underside of this cabinet, it's pretty dim. The real world counterpart to this light, for example, would cast a lot more of that ambient light back up into it. So that's the principle that I mean here with adjusting your intensity first, so where it hits that first point of contact, and the second being this indirect lighting intensity. So if I take this back up, I think I had it set to 50. And if we build our lighting, that's going to get that result that we're looking for, where it projects more of that energy back into the scene. So I'll go ahead and just double check this value, kick off lighting again, and then I'll come back and I'll actually show you the results, how it looks with that indirect lighting intensity boosted up. So let me check the value. We'll jump right back, build the lighting, and we'll see what we get. Okay, so now our lighting's done building, and you can see exactly the principle I was talking about, where by increasing, if I click this slide again, our indirect lighting intensity, which, by the way, the value was 35, not 50, by increasing that, we get a lot more of that ambient light bouncing kind of into the scene, but again, not affecting our direct point of contact, which is controlled by the intensity. Okay, so running through real quick kind of the rest of these settings. Again, most of these are pretty straightforward when it comes to lighting. The attenuation radius, so if I zoom back here a little bit, this is just how far that light casts out into the scene. Obviously, you don't want it too far, you don't want it too shallow. Make sure that it actually reaches those extents. Now, one thing to do take in mind is that the attenuation radius does have a direct relationship to your light fall off. By default, you have inverse square fall off, which, if you kind of imagine, let me take this down just a tad bit. How this works together is the light here is casting energy. With inverse square fall off, as the light gets further and further out to the extent of this cones, it gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Now, with inverse square fall off, that is pretty noticeable. So when you get about halfway, it's pretty dim. 3/4, it's very, very dim, and all the way out to the end, it's very, very difficult to see. By unchecking your inverse square fall off, you're effectively pushing the energy of that light, if you will, out towards the extent of this. So if you take this all the way down to say like 0.1, you can see here we get that really harsh kind of band line, that's because the light intensity here at the beginning of the light and the light intensity at the end is very, very close to the same. So if you increase this, you can see how it kind of gets more and more dim as it pushes out. So again, your attenuation radius is going to be how far that light calculates out into the scene. So just make sure it's set, reasonably at the right size. And your inverse square fall off, light fall off exponent will help you to push that light further so it has more intensity in that. Your inner cone and your outer cone radius are exactly what they sound like. So this blue, kind of bluish purple, that is our inner cone, and the outer cone is indicated by this kind of teal. Now, I typically like to have a little bit of space in between there, at least about 10 degrees, which is what this is, because if they're close together, you can see we've got this really harsh line, but if I feather the outside, you can see I get a little bit softer result. So ultimately, the core of this is going to be the main beam, which is your inner, and then the outer is going to kind of be that fall-off space in between. Okay, source radius. This is actually something that does take effect when it comes to baking your lighting. In particular, it also has to do with your specular highlights. The source radius, so if I increase this, you can see kind of the ball there. And actually, let me zoom in here a little bit so you can kind of see this. So I'm going to activate game mode, so it hides this. But if you watch this reflection kind of on this metal grading bar, as I decrease this and increase it, you can see that it kind of softens. You can think of the source radius as the theoretical light bulb. So by setting this somewhere, I think I had it around like 6 or 7, matches kind of close to what may be the spot of this light. It's very important to set that. Again, this is just, what would the theoretical bulb size be for this? That's going to be your source radius. Temperature, again, you could set color, you can set temperature. When using realistic stuff, I like using temperature. All the way down, you get that really kind of orange, very yellowish light. All the way up, you get a very, very cold blue light. So for this one, I think I was using like 3500, which should be kind of a nice, warm bulb. And then effect world, cast shadows, make sure that's on. And really the rest of this is set by default. Now, one thing I did check for this is under light mass, use area shadows for stationary lights. You can have this on, you can have it off. It does impact your render times just a little bit, but by using area shadows for stationary lights, that's going to get you just a little bit better shadow quality. But again, that's purely optional. You can have it on or off. But outside of that, that is the core principles of lighting that we're going to be focused on. And you'll see the rest of this throughout all the other just lighting examples that we use. So let's go ahead and jump to our next lighting type, and we'll take a look at that. We'll come back to the emissive one where we've got the light bars underneath the cabinet. But for the next one, let's go ahead and focus on our omnidirectional point light. So this next example is our point light. Now this will be much faster than the previous one because I'm not going to go through and explain the different settings because that should be apparent now. But what I am going to show you is how I set up this light to get me a really nice bake result in our scene. So with that, I've set our intensity to 4. Actually, let me back up a little bit. So mobility is set to static, so there's no dynamic light. This is purely just bake lighting. The intensity is set at 4, so that's going to be my first point of contact. I've set my attenuation radius, which you can see kind of indicated by this bubble. My source radius, which is 12, and that's going to be, again, the effective theoretical size of the light bulb in engine. I've set my soft source radius just a little bit bigger so I can get, especially on these contact shadows, where it's just a little bit more refined and a little bit softer. I've set my temperature to 3500, again, to match the rest of kind of my warm bulbs. I've increased my indirect lighting intensity, and you'll see that once we bake this, because by default, when this would light, it would impact where you see the direct light right now, but the rest of the scene was super, super dim, and it didn't look good at all. And then I also adjusted my light fall-off exponent. So again, this was set if I have inverse. You can see it gets really soft. It's just not the result I was looking for. Unchecked it, dropped it down, so we've got a lot more energy from or intensity from where the bulb starts to the end on the outer sides of our attenuation radius. So that's it. That's all I've changed on this one. So I'm going to go ahead and just, again, under our production build, I'm going to build lighting. And then I'll show you kind of the results that we get with this. I'll zoom out a little bit so it's easier to see. And once that's done building, we'll jump right back and we'll see the results that we get from our point light. All right, perfect. So our lighting's built, and the results look great. Again, with the splotchiness and some of the lighting artifacts, that's only because we're working in a preview build as opposed to production. But overall, the lamp actually looks very nice. It's getting that kind of warm, rich glow to it. The light looks good. The intensity on the wall where the light bulb's at is perfect, and you can see that it actually floods into the room pretty well. And gets us kind of the results that we're looking for. So that is just using a point light, which I guess I should back up. If you don't know where the lights are, inside your modes panel, under lights, this is where we're pulling all these from. So very, very standard lights in Unreal. So that's our point light cast into the scene. So let's go ahead and move on to our next example, which is this kind of floor lamp that we have. And we'll take a look at how that works, how to set up a quick blueprint for it so we can use it throughout the rest of our scene. So let's go ahead and jump to that. All right, so for this next example, I'm going to go ahead and switch to unlit mode and show you what we have here. So I have this visual asset, which is a lamp, and inside of there is this spotlight. Now, I've done something a little different with this setup that you might find very useful as well. And in that, I've created a blueprint. Now, it's not a blueprint in the sense of what you would think in terms of, very robust, very programming centric. It's more or less just a prefab. And with that, so if I go ahead and just open this, I'll show you what's happening here. It's simply just the lamp itself, and then the light that we have in here, the spotlight, just combined together. Now, the way that we did that is I threw both of these in the scene. You select both of them, and then you can go under blueprints, and you can do, I think there's one is like, create blueprint of assets. And with that, that is what we get. So if I, actually, let me reopen that real quick. And that's what we get right here. This is great, and the reason why you'd want to use that is, for example, I have this lamp here, but I've also used this lamp in the bedroom. The nice part is that if I make changes to the blueprint as opposed to the asset in the scene, it'll propagate throughout the rest of the level and everything. We also use that here for our track light, but I won't cover that right here. So yeah, so with this, if I go back in, and let me go ahead and just open my blueprint again. So if I go in here, what I've done with this particular light is a couple different things. So again, we're going to run through this very quickly, very briefly, but I just want to show you how to get the lighting results that I did using the settings that I changed in there. So let me go move this out, and we'll kind of zoom out just a little bit so we can see both. So with this, the light itself, I've set to static. My intensity of 3.5, again, if I'm looking at my first point of contact where it hits this couch, that's going to be influenced by the intensity. The attenuation radius I've taken out to about 600, so it casts relatively far. Inner cone is 50, outer cone is 70. I tried to match something with the cone of the light itself. Obviously, I didn't want it too broad. I didn't want it too focused. So 50 and 70 worked really well for that. Source radius is 10, so if you kind of zoom in here, you can see the theoretical light bulb size, which is set by this 10. Temperature was set to 4,000. I didn't color it. I just used the temperature. And then my indirect lighting intensity, I've increased to 15. Again, that's going to be the secondary energy that this light uses to cast into the scene. By default, it would light the couch, and that was about it. So I set this to 15. The next thing I did is actually change the light fall off to 4. So again, that pushes more of that light towards the extents of the outer cone. And then finally, the last thing that I changed was using this IES texture. Let me go ahead and show you what this is. There are multiple ways that you can get this, but essentially what an IES texture is, light bulb manufacturers create kind of this mathematical representation of the way that the light reacts inside of the bulb and the way that it casts. So if you look, there's plenty of different options. Now this one was from a Unreal Marketplace pack. I believe it was the light profile pack. And in that I had a few different choices, but I chose this star bow. So you can see that we kind of get some different light bending and bleeding on that, which once we build lighting, you'll see. So that was my setup here with the spotlight inside of this floor lamp. So let me go ahead and close this. I'll switch us back to lit mode. Here's something else to note too. Before I build lighting, you can actually have one-offs on these blueprints. So for example, I think, let me see, I'll browse to the asset. Yeah, so I could throw in another one of these lamps, say right here, and you can see the benefit of us having a blueprint. It stays together as a prefab. But in it, I can actually click the blueprint, and in my details panel, I can select this lighting component and make adjustments to it. So say, for example, I wanted this one to be, say, like cool, and I wanted it to be really intense. That's probably way too much. We'll take it to 10. You can see that by me affecting, by clicking in the blueprint and adjusting this single one, it doesn't change the larger blueprint. Now, say for example, I change the color intensity to this one, I want it to propagate, I just need to go back into the blueprint itself, go back into my lighting component, make the changes there, compile and save, and then every other single one will have those changes as well. So just know that when you create a blueprint, you can still do one-offs with each one, which is great. But it also makes sure that things are standardized. So, all right, so I'm going to zoom back out here. We'll switch our game mode on, and then I'm going to go ahead and go under my build lighting quality, set to preview. We'll build lighting, and we'll see how this light actually affects the rest of the scene. So we'll jump right back when that's finished. Okay, so our lighting's done building, and you can see the results that we get. Again, some of the artifacts, it's just because it's in preview mode. And ignore, we actually had a secondary light in here, so you can see this is one derived from that same blueprint. So that's what you see, kind of this light casting out of here. But overall, the results that we get from it are excellent. We get, you know, that really nice, it's not too bright on the couch. We could make it brighter. That's our first point of contact. But the rest of the scene fills out really well. It's got a really nice bounce light, which again is affected by our indirect lighting intensity. So if I click here, set to 15, and that gets us a really nice result. And because it's in our blueprint, we can use this over and over again, and we're going to get consistent results. So if we put a lot of these lamps in, it would look exactly how we expect it to. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is move on to the next one, which is our track light, and show you how we set this up. Very similar to the previous example, but let's go ahead and step through that process. All right, for this next example, we're going to take a look at this track light that we've created. Now, like the previous example, this is simply just a prefab blueprint, or I guess I should say, technically a blueprint, but it acts more like a prefab. So if I open this up, we'll go ahead and take a look at the settings that we have here. So I'm going to switch to my viewport mode so we can see the asset. So we've got this static mesh, which is again just our track light, and we've got 4 spotlights. I'm sorry, 5. If I can count well. There's 5 spotlights, and they're identical for all intents and purposes. So they're all the same, and that's actually really easy to do in here. By shift selecting all of these, I can make changes to one, and they'll change for all of those. So again, I'm not going to go too deep into how we've set this up, because that was covered in previous examples, but let's just run through the settings real quick. So light intensity of 1.3. Again, that's going to be my first point of contact. In particular, what I'm looking for is this spotlight, when it hits the floor, my first point of contact, is it bright enough? Is it too dark? And I would increase this appropriately. My temperature I've set to 5500, so I wanted these to be more on that cooler side, so it's a little bit more blue. I've set my attenuation radius to 700, so a little bit larger, just to make sure that it pushes in the extents of the scene. So you can see here by our cone. The inner cone angle 45, outer cone angle 65. The reason why this is a little bit more narrow banded is because these particular lights, you can see they're almost the size of like a small pop can, and so with that they have a tighter beam. So the interior, so indicated by the blue, that's our inner cone angle, and then our outer cone angle is how far it affects. And then lastly, I'm sorry, 2 more things, is I've also changed my light fall off exponent to 0.1. Again, that's because this light, by default, would be bright, but as soon as it starts to get to the outside of the cone, it started getting too dim. So by me lowering this, it effectively has more energy in pushing itself to the extents of that outer cone. And then lastly, I have my indirect lighting intensity set to 30, which again is going to impact, so if I press escape, switch to game mode. So in this view right now, because the lighting's not built, this is essentially my direct intensity, but that light bouncing back into the scene is going to be the indirect lighting intensity. So I'll go ahead and hold this position right here, and let's go ahead and just kick off our lighting build, and we'll see the results that we get from this. As a side note, you may notice a lamp over here looks like it's lit. That is not actually lit by any lighting. That is actually just an emissive on that material to make it look like it's being lit. So ignore that in terms of there's really no lighting on there. So let's go ahead and let our track lighting build. We'll come back and we'll see the results that we get. Okay, our lighting is done building, and as you can see, the results are beautiful. Again, this is on kind of a preview as opposed to production lighting build, and it looks great. So again, to cover the settings here that are going to be real important, in the actual light itself, intensity, first point of contact on the floor, our indirect lighting intensity, so all the light that you see kind of spilling back into the room, it will be controlled by this indirect lighting intensity. And then finally, our cone angles and our light exponential fall off. So I'm going to show you one thing here real quick that as I was putting this together, I think it was good to point out. If I take a look at this floor right here, you can see I get that really kind of harsh light, which may not actually be what I want. So how do I affect that? How do I change that? That's very simple. So if I go into here in this light component, the reason that's happening is because this light fall off exponent. So because I have it set at 0.1, which is actually lower than if you were to drag it, you can only drag it to 0.2. By setting it to 0.1, it means that the energy of this light, so let me activate game mode, the energy of the light right here is pretty close to the same on the extents. But if you notice, our cone angle stops there. So that's why we're getting that really, really harsh lighting. So if I wanted to change this, and again, here's another example why I think this is really good. If I go into my track light, the blueprint itself, because I don't want to affect just the single one in my scene, I want to affect all of them. I'm going to select all my lighting components, and let me move this out of the way a little bit so we can see. I'm going to change my light fall off exponent to say 1. Or actually, you know what, let's take it to 2, which is, again, the lowest we can drag it. And then I'm also going to increase my cone, the attenuation radius of that cone. So by increasing this, let's say, 800, not 80, 800, you can see now it actually reaches the extents of the floor. So now when we bake our lighting, that harsh band should go away. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and save this. And again, this is where it's really nice by using these blueprints. By simply coming in, selecting this, and duplicating it, it now inherits the exact same settings. So I essentially have this template light that I can use throughout my whole scene. Okay, so that covers our, I believe, 4th lighting type. And now what we're going to do is cover the very, very last one, which is using emissive material to actually cast light into a scene. So let's go ahead and jump over and get started with that. Okay, so for our 5th and final lighting type that you'll probably run into in while building your stuff is the ability in Engine to use an emissive material to cast light into the scene. So I'm in unlit mode right now just because we don't have our lighting built. And I have these, I'll switch over to my details panel, and I have these cubes. Again, they're nothing more. So if I go over into geometry, actually, I'm sorry, let me do basic cube. We don't want the volume. I've simply just dragged a cube in the scene. I've scaled it down so it's, something more akin to like an LED light bar. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And I've positioned those underneath our cabinets. Okay, so with this, I've actually created a material for this. Let me go and open this. This is our instance, and this is the master. Let me explain what the master is. It's super complicated, let me tell you. Not really, actually. In there, I've got 2 parameters that I've made. One is my color, so you can click number 3. Hold down 3, left click, or you can click in here, and I think it's 3 vector, constant 3 vector, yeah, there we go. And you can right click, convert to parameter, and that way it exposes. But again, there's a whole series I did on master materials with this, exposing parameters. But for this, I simply just created a color. I've also created an emissive parameter to multiply, pump the color into our base color, and pump the emissive using this guy. Now, I'm going to show this real fast on screen so you guys can screenshot it if you want to. But in particular, because I'm using this material and I want it to act like a light, there's really not a value or a parameter inside of your material setup to be able to do the Kelvin scale. So if you remember on our other lights, we're able to go through and set it from, that kind of yellowy light to more the blue light. I will link this in the description, but I found a great website where someone has actually taken the Kelvin values and converted them to RGB, which is what these are. So that's the numbers you see on top here, so red, green, and blue, respectively. But this actually derives from that table he created. So this is, I believe this is I think 10,000 Kelvin, and this is down to like 3,000 Kelvin. So you can use it in there, but of course, these are just sitting off on the side. They don't affect the material itself. So the two parameters, the last thing that I've changed is inside the material itself. If you scroll down, I've simply checked this used with static lighting. So this gives the ability for that material to be calculated in your lighting build. So that's really all you need to do for the material setup. Again, very, very simple. Nothing complex. So from that, I actually created this material instance, which has those parameters. I've gone in, I've changed my color value, so I'll just increase this. This is, again, based off of that Kelvin to RGB conversion scale, and something that gives me just a little bit warmer look to it for the color. And then I've changed the emissive to 8. Now, the key thing to note here is that this emissive parameter, so again, if I jump back to material, which is this multiplier, this is ultimately how bright this theoretical light would be. So I found 8 to be really good for something that would be this size of the bar. But if you notice that that emissive light isn't bright enough, you increase the emissive value. So again, very simple material setup, nothing complex, but allows me to be able to assign this to multiple, again, pieces of geometry or assets in the level to act as faux lighting. So, okay. Now the next thing is after I've placed this in there, if you scroll down and on the lighting build, there's one other setting that you need to change. I'm sorry, technically two, but the critical one is you need to make sure that you have this use emissive for static lighting. Once this is checked, again, once you go to build your lighting, this will be calculated in there. The second thing is this emissive boost. So if you recall, in fact, let me jump back to like our undermount light. If you recall, we had this indirect lighting intensity, which was the ability of that light to push and bounce more light into the scene. For emissive, so when you're using a material, we don't have that parameter. Instead, we have this emissive boost. So by increasing this, again, your first point of contact, so what you see close to it, is going to be controlled through our material, so effectively the emissive brightness that we have. And then the rest, how much it pushes into the scene, will be controlled by this emissive boost. So I'm going to take this back down to the default, which is 1, and I'll go ahead and switch back to lit mode. We'll go to game view. I'm going to go ahead and build this real fast, just again on preview. So we'll build lighting. We'll take a look at the results, and then we'll make that tweak on the actual piece of geometry itself. Oh, actually, you know what? Hold on before we do that. I forgot we have it on 2 components, so we'll change this one back to 1. So both of these should be set at, emissive boost of 1. Let's go ahead and build that. As soon as that's finished, we'll jump back, and then I'll show you how to change that to get a better lighting result. Okay, so now our lighting's built, and again, as you can see, it acts like a faux light, which is great. There's not an actual light in the scene. It's simply just using that emissive for static lighting. But again, if you recall, I said that I knew that from the initial testing and setting the scene up that the emissive boost of 1 just wasn't bright enough. It looks good, but let's go ahead and just do this. We'll increase this back to 10. Again, I have both selected here. I've set both to 10. Let's go ahead and build lighting. We'll see the results and show you just the difference that increasing that emissive boost does make. All right, there we go. So our lighting is done building, and we can see that by increasing the emissive boost, we definitely get a lot more of that light pushing into the scene. So, okay, so that covers all of the, what I think are the 5 basic lighting types that you'll probably run into when it comes to interior lighting. So in part, I think 3 or part 4, whatever one this is. In the next part, we'll actually cover combining those all together to really get our full baked lighting. So let's go ahead and move on to that process.